Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. Welcome to another episode of Sapient Thoughts, where we discuss theophilosophical issues, where we answer contentions against Islam, and where we provide a robust case for the veracity of Islam. In today's episode, we're going to be continuing our multi-part series on beauty and the recognition of God. Now, in the last episode, we had discussed the idea of an individual's cognitive limitations. And we discussed a few things related to that. We discussed how one's environment, where one lives or what the surroundings of a person may be, can actually have an impact on their cognition. In other words, it could lead to a type of cognitive bias. So with that said, the other question one could ask related to that is that how do we transcend that cognitive bias? And if there are limitations, if there are epistemic limitations one has, how do we broaden our epistemic limitations such that we're able to have a wider epistemic sphere? And one answer to that question would be to take information from other people. So if indeed we have cognitive limitations and cognitive biases, then perhaps we can rely on others for information and skills and knowledge and things like that. And to highlight this point, there's a statement from Elizabeth Fricker, who is a philosopher and researcher at Oxford University, I believe. And she writes about this concept of extending one's epistemic limitations. And she says it should be immediately obvious that in the conditions of modern life, we rely hugely on the epistemic and practical skills of others. For example, I allow my car mechanic to find out what is at fault with my car when it won't start. And I then proceed to ask him or her to fix it for me. And one relies on one's doctor to use information from symptoms and medical tests to diagnose what is wrong with one and then to prescribe an appropriate treatment. Now, the point here is that no individual person can gather knowledge about every single field that one may need. And so thus one relies on the skills and knowledge of others. And hence that epistemic limitation can be extended. And indeed it is extended because we rely on doctors, we rely on pilots to fly planes, and all of those areas of information that we don't have, or those skills that we don't have, we rely on the information and knowledge and skills of others. Now that's fine, but coming back to my original thesis, and that was that if a person is engaged or if a person would like to know truth as it really is, how could they do that? Well, the thesis that I put forth is that if a person wants to know truth as it really is, an exposure to beauty or natural beauty can cause a person or allow a person to see truth as it really is. That being the case, we understand we have cognitive limitations, so perhaps one could say, well, I can't fully 100% trust my cognition, my own individual cognitive abilities. So then, therefore, if I want to see truth as it really is, can I just trust the cognitive abilities of others and the knowledge and skills of others? Well, that's what we wanted to discuss in today's episode, is that what we want to see is that even though our epistemic limitations can be widened, or our epistemic borders can be broadened, can be widened because of the skills and knowledge and cognitive abilities of others, that also will not allow us to see truth as it really is in some sort of absolute fashion. So let's highlight this point specifically. When most people think about a map of the world, they usually see a map where you have North America and South America, you have Europe and Asia, and then below that, if we're looking at vertical positioning, you have parts of Africa that are below the equator, Australia being below the equator, New Zealand, etc. This is the map as we generally see it, and it can be traced back to Ptolemy. And Ptolemy, when he first drew the map of the world as it was known in his day, drew Europe on top and drew Africa, or the known parts of the world of Africa at that time, on the bottom. Now the thing is, we may think that, okay, well, this is just how the map of the world was drawn. There's no sort of bias in this. But when we compare Ptolemy's map to other cartographers, for instance, when we look at the 12th century cartographer by the name of Muhammad al-Idrisi, we see that when he drew his map, he in fact put Africa on the top of the map and placed Europe on the bottom of the map. Now, one may ask, well, which map then is correct? Would it be, Europe on the bottom and Africa on top, if we're talking about vertical positioning? Or would it be the maps as we know them today, which, as I mentioned, can be traced back to Ptolemy, where Europe is on top and Africa is on the bottom, and of course North America, South America, so on? Which map is correct? Well, the reality is neither map can be said to be objectively correct, because if one was to travel to outer space, there's no sort of anchoring point and there's no sort of positioning, vertical positioning, whereby one could make a judgment call. In other words, imagine if you're in outer space, because there's no sort of positioning, there's no anchoring for you, you could see, Europe on top and Africa on the bottom, but again, because of lack of gravity and things like that, you could very well think it completely normal to see Africa on top and Europe on the bottom when we're talking about vertical positioning. So there is no anchorage point. So why did Ptolemy draw his map the way he did and Muhammad al-Idrisi draw his map the way he did? Well, one reason that we may put forth is that the maps were drawn based on one's worldview. Now, if you have not yet seen the episodes where we discussed worldviews, I highly recommend you check out that Sapient Thought series on worldviews and the fitrah. Now, that being said, we could assume that this is based on one's worldview. Perhaps Ptolemy, when he was drawing his map, the known world at the time, or the known civilized world at the time, was indeed Europe. Everything beyond Europe may have been considered less civilized. And thus, when we're talking about vertical positioning, perhaps there's also the idea that something that's on top is higher and better and superior, whereas something on the bottom, i.e. that which is less civilized, is of a lower value, is less than. And so you have this vertical positioning which has this significance in terms of superiority. And perhaps this may be the reason why. Now, when we come to Muhammad al-Idrisi's map, we may assume the same thing. Perhaps because of Muhammad al-Idrisi's worldview, and when he was drawing a map, he understood, because he's coming from an Islamic worldview, Islam to be superior, and therefore the Arabian Peninsula and Africa to be drawn on top, with Mecca and Medina to be drawn on top, and Europe to be drawn on the bottom. This is one reason why the map may be drawn in this way, or why Muhammad al-Idrisi may have drawn the map in this way. But yet, another aspect of Muhammad al-Idrisi's worldview that can be considered, or can be taken into consideration, is that indeed he comes from an Islamic worldview. That being said, when you look at the map that Muhammad al-Idrisi drew, there's a couple of interesting features. One of those features is that when you look at the vertical positioning in comparison to the cardinal direction. So when we're talking about vertical positioning, we're talking about up and down. When we're talking about cardinal positioning, we're talking about north, south, east, west. So in the map that Muhammad al-Idrisi drew, it's interesting that the term for south he placed on top, so Junub. The term for north, which is Shimal, he placed on the bottom. And the term for east is on the left, and the term for west is on the right. Now, so it's not only the idea of a map being drawn, let's say, with Africa on top and the Arabian Peninsula on top and Europe on the bottom, but even the cardinal direction has been drawn differently, or has been labeled differently. So one of the reasons we may put forth is that in the Islamic framework, or in the Islamic tradition, Islamic paradigm, there is the concept of the prayer. And the prayer timings are dependent upon the sun. And so when one is looking at the sun, one may start off in the morning time by looking or gazing east. And so if one is looking at the sun, it's rising from there, they understand that this would be the east. Where it sets, gharb, right, that's setting, would be west in the English language. So we have these two terms that are very clear. Now the thing is, what about terms on the right and the left? So the term that we have for south is Junub. The term we have for north is Shimal. Well, we know that the term for left in the Arabic language, you can say that that is also Shimal. For instance, there's a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam where he said, "La ta'kulu bishimal, fa inna shaytanu ya'kulu bishimal." Do not eat with your left hand, for indeed shaitan eats with his left hand. The term for left hand here, or left, is shimal. So left would be shimal, north, and on the right would be junub, or the south. So when he's drawing the map, you have one element of the positioning of the sun based on the idea of the prayers and the prayer timings and how we understand the sun. And so Muhammad al-Idrisi's worldview is going to have an impact on how he's drawing the map, not only in terms of vertical positioning, but also in terms of cardinal direction. All of that is based on a person's worldview. And so therefore, there's no sort of objective right and wrong, but it's based on the person's worldview. And from one perspective, one would say that that's based on an assumption, or a philosophical assumption, or a first principle. If you remember from what we had discussed in the series or the episodes on worldviews and the fitrah. Now, you may ask, well, so what? I mean, it's just a map, right? I mean, does it really have any sort of consequences? And the thing is, there's actually real world consequences to having to relying upon a certain map over another. There was a study that was done that's called On Southbound Ease and Northbound Fees: Literal Consequences of the Metaphoric Link Between Vertical Position and Cardinal Direction. And this was a study that was done by Nelson and Simmons in 2009. And what they did in this study is that they were trying to see that within human perception, how do they feel when it comes to vertical positioning, in the sense that do they consider something up and going in that direction to be more difficult as opposed to going down, right? And so remember, vertical positioning here related to cardinal direction meaning north, south, vertical positioning up, down. Like there may be a perception that a person is thinking, if I'm going north, I'm going up. And so therefore going up may seem harder. Again, they talk about metaphoric link, right? And going south may seem easier. It's kind of like thinking about going uphill versus downhill. When in reality, you're not really going uphill or downhill per se by going north and south. So they wanted to put this to the test, and they came to some conclusions with their study. They said, in one part of their study, they said, we reported 7 studies that demonstrate that the metaphoric association between cardinal direction and vertical position is pervasive and consequential. Indeed, information about cardinal direction can affect consumers' judgment of time, effort, and cost. Specifically, because they associate north with up and south with down, consumers expect northbound travel to be more time-consuming, less convenient, and costlier than southbound travel. Now, of course, as the study goes on, there was some of the things that were highlighted in the study was that certain transportation companies took advantage of that. So they would charge people for going the same distance, going north, they would charge them more than going south. And all of this is not really based on any sort of real objective understanding of north and south, of vertical position or cardinal direction. Because as we saw, the map is something you can't say one's objectively true or not, because again, if one wants to go in outer space, how do you tell which one is up and which one is down? But yet it has real world consequences. And therefore, the point I wanted to highlight in this particular section, in this particular episode, is that we rely on maps and things like that, but even the maps that we rely on, which we're relying on the judgment of the cartographer, who in turn has his or her own cognitive limitations and biases and worldviews and so on and so forth. So if we have cognitive limitations and we want to extend or we want to transcend our cognitive biases and extend our epistemic limitations, we can do that by way of other people and the expertise of other people. But they in turn are going to have cognitive limitations, and they're going to have epistemic limitations and cognitive biases in and of themselves. So if that's the case, in our quest to see truth as it truly is, how are we to do that? And this is especially true when we're talking about the concept of the divine. This is a deep question that has real world and afterworld implications. So when one is trying to see the truth of this particular question as it is, if one understands cognitive limitations of oneself and the cognitive limitations of someone else, how can one extend those cognitive limitations? Well, one of the ways to do that, and this is what's being presented as a thesis in this series, is that when one has exposure to natural beauty, it actually enhances one's cognition. And that exposure to natural beauty also has another effect. And that effect can help a person to see truth as it really is. What is that effect? Well, we're going to talk about that in the next episode of the series. So until then, this is Fahad Taslim, and these are Sapient Thoughts.